Hey everyone, welcome back. I bet you didn't know this, but there's actually a rock in your kitchen, and you eat it. I'm Devin, and I'm working through Material World by Ed Conway, the book about the 6 raw materials that hold up modern civilization. Last time we were talking about sand, today we're talking about salt. And I know salt sounds like a downgrade, at least sand got turned into computer chips. Salt goes on french fries. But hear me out. Salt is the reason why 2 empires could afford their armies, why one of them lost India, and why the water out of your tap will not kill you. Eating it is honestly the least interesting thing we do. So, I'm guessing your relationship with salt is probably just with the shaker on your table. So, here's 2 authorities who care a little bit more about it than you. First, you have a goat. Goats genuinely walk absurd distances to lick mineral deposits and will climb near vertical walls to find salt veins. They do this because their natural diets don't give them enough sodium, and their bodies literally send them out searching for rocks. The second person I wanted to introduce you to is Gordon Ramsay. On Masterclass, one of his shows, he has a quote very distinctly. He goes, "Don't buy shit salt." So ultimately, both of these people care about the same thing, which ultimately is salt. But so what actually is salt? Salt is not so much as a thing as it is actually a category. Salt is... Okay, really quickly before I go into any more. This is, again, a very big oversimplification of generally a simplification. So if you're interested, go read more. But what any salt actually is a positive ion and a negative ion stacked together in a grid where the charges cancel out. So you get net zero in the end. That's basically the whole definition. And so the most common pairing you'll find is sodium and chlorine, but there's actually thousands of others. And so one of the cool things about salts is they conduct electricity, but they have to be wet. The dry crystal doesn't conduct anything because the ions are locked in place. But when you dissolve it, they become loose and liquid carries the current, which is important. So lastly, the scale. We pulled about 270 million tons of salt out of the ground in the sea, and in the US, 42% of that went to chemical plants and 37% of it went to roads. So most of what we use it for, there's also no substitute at all. And eating it is not even close to 10% of the actual salt we produce and use. Okay, so jumping on to China. So for most of imperial China, the emperor was said to have the power to rule because he had something called the backing, or not called, but it was called the mandate of heaven. Heaven basically grants you the right to rule, and if you rule badly, heaven will take it back. This conveniently explains why sort of every dynasty collapsed and a new one was able to take its place. Now, this is sort of me going off of my own, so don't go quoting it or anything, but I found heaven to be a very vague and ambiguous topic, and the salt monopoly to be much more concrete. So in 119 BC, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty nationalized the salt in the nation to pay for a war that a land tax couldn't cover. This salt was the perfect tax. Everyone had to buy it and no one could make their own. Ultimately, this was extremely lucrative, and they ended up winning the war. So a couple centuries later in the Tang Dynasty, salt accounted for more than half of the government income. So sure, heaven may have backed an emperor, but heaven also seemed to have a revenue stream. And the cool thing about this was it works both ways. So during the Tang Dynasty, they were making so much money because they priced salt very, very high. But when you price a necessity that high, you invent a black market, which ultimately has money and muscle. And in the 870s, a smuggler named Huang Chao took over an existing rebellion, sacked the capital city, and declared himself the emperor. Ultimately, the Tang Empire sort of survived, but it never really recovered. Which is sort of an example of the same engine that sort of feeds you can also eat you just as easily. So now on to a different salt. Chinese alchemists were very into saltpeter, which grows on cave walls and burns purple. You can see it here in the middle picture. This was not initially supposed to be a weapon. They were ultimately looking for immortality, and so instead, when they heated it with some sulfur and carbon and found it went boom, they were rather disappointed. They ended up calling this substance huayao, which is fire medicine, and it's still the word for gunpowder, which I thought was cool because the name is literally a recipe of how the product gone wrong, was how gunpowder is a health medicine that went very, very wrong. Ultimately, saltpeter is a nitrate, and that is going to be important later because it ultimately starts war and is the reason another one didn't end as quickly as it could have. In the end, the monopoly didn't die with the Tang Dynasty. It ran for another 2,000 years. China only scrapped their full control of salt prices in 2017. So the world's oldest monopoly only ended 9 years ago. And even to this day, China still has licenses and a salt police to help keep, make sure everything stays above board. Okay, jumping on to Britain, well, more specifically India, in the 1930s. So Britain ran a salt monopoly called the Salt Act, through the Salt Act of 1882, which was very similar to the nationalizing of the salt by Emperor Wu of the Han. Basically, Indians were not allowed to legally make, sell, or gather their own salt. So what Gandhi did to sort of protest this was he wrote a letter to the viceroy and basically said, I'm going to go break your law. And then on the 12th day of March, he walked out of the place he was and then walked like 200 miles to the beach and picked up a grain of salt off of the coast. This was a crime. It went extremely viral around the world and sort of was a huge awakening point for the globe around the conditions of the British occupation of India. Around 60,000 people were arrested that year for making salt, Gandhi included. Ultimately, the turning point in the Indian independence movement happened a couple months later in May. While Gandhi was in prison, another activist led a march on the government salt works where they basically just lined up and walked in and understood that they were just going to get beaten with clubs, dragged to the side, and the next people were going to come. There was an American reporter there this time, and he sort of recorded the entire story and took horrific photos and ran it in newspapers all around the world. So what this did was, in effect, it didn't actually repeal the tax, but what it did is it really damaged the Britain's ability to call what they were doing in India civilized. An empire can sort of absorb criticism. It can't really absorb people queuing up or photographs of people queuing up to be clubbed because they believe what you're doing is worse than that. Okay, so jumping back to the asterisk we had on slide 3 about how salt needs to be dissolved in water for the ions to come loose and create a brine which can carry a current. If you run a current through a brine on purpose, basically the chlorine comes off one side, the hydrogen comes off the other, and you're left with sodium hydroxide in the tank. This is called the chloralkali process, and it's one of the least famous, most important things on Earth. Basically, the chlorine that comes out of this goes into your water treatment, so it is why all drinking water and tap water is safe to be consumed. It also goes into PVC, so the pipes that protect the internet and everything that runs. Also, a lot of the water is brought through PVC pipe. Then the sodium hydroxide is turned into paper, salt, detergent, and aluminum. And Conway reckons that this cheap salt has done more to increase life expectancy among humans than any single medical breakthrough in the past 2 centuries. So also hold on to the chlorine that comes out of this, because it will be important in a little bit. Okay, so jumping back to nitrogen, which is where this picture comes from. If you're thinking this picture looks familiar, that's probably because it's a Modern Warfare 2 map, I believe. Maybe it's Modern Warfare 3. I think Rust is 3. Regardless, this picture is actually of an abandoned nitrate town in Chile. So why did they build this big giant ass structure and then it got abandoned? So basically, plants need nitrogen, and the air is about 80% nitrogen, but very little of it is usable because nitrogen is basically bound to itself in like an N2 sort of form in the atmosphere, and it's too stable to really crack for like by plants or animals in an energy efficient way. So your options were really manure and then guano, which is basically another type of bird poop. And then lastly was a giant sodium nitrate deposit in Chile. So this deposit sat on a border that no one agreed on, and in 1879, Chile went to a war over it and ultimately won. This is one of the towns that was built, or one of the excavation sites that was built around the mine, and it was left Chile with a near monopoly on fertilizers and explosives going into the 1900s, which would be a big problem if you're Germany, because the food and ammunition you now need to fight World War I is arriving on ships past the British Navy, who can blockade either Chile or Greenland, or Germany, excuse me. Which brings us to our next people. So first Fritz Harper and then Carl Bosch at scale worked together to pull nitrogen out of the air. Basically, they combine a combination of heat, pressure, and an iron catalyst gets ammonia, which you can turn into fertilizer and explosives. Germans basically called this bread from air. It was a miraculous discovery and ultimately caused World War II to extend for an extra 2 years, because Germany could continue fueling their ammunitions with this nitrogen. And it's like still used today, so much so that about half the nitrogen atoms in your body likely came out of a reactor. So as you can tell, Fritz Harper is clearly more important, as I have 3 pictures of him up on the screen, and I want to talk about him a little more. So ultimately, he was a German patriot who was Jewish by birth and converted to Protestantism, and then devoted his life to Germany. He's like quoted to have said, "A scientist belongs to the world in peacetime and his country in a time of war." And boy, did he mean it. So Germany went a few months into World War II went into World War I with a few months of ammunition because they assumed it would be over by Christmas. Then the British Navy blockaded their ports. The Chilean nitrate stopped arriving. No nitrate, no explosives. This is why they were saying, historians suggest that without this process, Germany likely would have had to end World War II 2 years earlier. But Harper didn't just stop at fertilizer. So remember how I said hold on to chlorine? He also had that idea. He proposed using it as a gas and ultimately supervised the release of a ton of it into the wind. This molecule, which is the same molecule that makes your water safe to drink, is extremely dangerous to humans when it is released in a gas form, and ultimately produced horrific results. He was greatly celebrated in the German military, promoted, and sort of spent the next 18 years of his life as one of the more celebrated scientists in Germany until 1933, when the Nazis decided he was a Jew and ordered him to fire all of his Jewish staff. ultimately, he decided not to, resigned, and left his position and died in a hotel in Basel, in January of 1934 of sort of unknown causes. And so he was fully gone for this last part, but it's also kind of the most fucked up because the pest gas that he developed ultimately became the same gas that the Nazis used at Auschwitz to kill his own family members. So yeah, there's not really a good way to sum up this man and his contributions, but ultimately he dedicated his life to science and helped create some of the most successful and destructive inventions of his generation. That's all I have. That's all for Salt. Thanks for watching. If you're interested, please go check out the book by Ed Conway. It is a lot of fun. Iron should be next if I can get my act together. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.